So stressful. All right. Okay. We are going to welcome. We are going to give everybody a chance to kind of start filtering in. We are so very excited to be hosting this webinar today. All right. Welcome, welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Our lovely co-host, Davy, is located in Ireland, so all the way across on the other side of the pond. So it is evening for him, and he is so wonderful to stick around and do this webinar with us. Welcome, welcome. Everyone's filtering in. We're so excited to have you all here today. We'll get this kicked off in just probably one more minute. All right. Welcome if you are just joining, and thanks so much for being here today. All right, we are going to get this rolling, and we'll do a little bit of a slow start with some introductions to let people keep filtering in. So, welcome. We're so excited that everyone is here today for this amazing conversation. I'm Elizabeth. I'm one of the co-founders over here at Rock Paper Coin and your host for today's webinar. If we have not met before, Rock Paper Coin is a payment platform built for small business owners just like you. And it's really designed to make your life incredibly easy around contracts and invoicing, your payments, proposals, you name it. We are easy and affordable. And that is why we started building this platform. It's very important, especially in today's economy, to be keeping track of all of the back end of your business. And that is really what we want to be doing, is supporting you and acting like your business assistant. Okay, so just one little housekeeping thing before we start. So please head to the Zoom chat and change your settings to chat with everyone, not just the panelist or the host. If you could just drop in, say a little hello, let us know who you are, where you're coming from. Drop in your Instagram handles if you would like, or any other socials, so that we can be following each other. We will put our link in the chat as well. So take a second and make sure you're following us and Stripe as well. So. All right, without further ado, then we will go ahead and get started. All right, so I have already introduced myself, but it is my absolute pleasure to welcome Davy to this webinar. Welcome, Davy.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Elizabeth. Hi, everyone. My name is Dabi Wambweze. I work on the Global Payments Performance team at Stripe. We help our biggest users to identify optimization opportunities across fraud, network cost, authentication, and authorization. I'm more focused on the fraud optimization pillar within the team, and I've been on the team for slightly over 1 year now. But prior to this role, I worked as a risk fraud specialist for about 4+ years at Stripe, where I helped users to navigate various types of fraud risk, especially card testing. One fun fact about me is that I actually got married about 6 months ago, and I promise you that I didn't file disputes on any transaction with my wedding vendors. So I'm not necessarily contributing to the issue we're discussing today.
Amazing. So, as you have heard, Davy is really quite an expert, and we're just very excited to have him here. And he's going to be walking us through kind of some tips and tricks to go over just kind of like disputes 101. So over the next, 40-ish minutes, here's really what we want to cover and just make this webinar as impactful as possible. So what is a dispute? Because sometimes there's a little bit of some misconceptions about disputes, top myths, common triggers, especially that we see in the wedding industry, what to expect in the dispute process, If you are not a member on Rock Paper Coin, we're going to walk through what that looks like when it's directly with Stripe, and we're going to walk through what that looks like directly when it's with Rock Paper Coin. Best practices, and then we're going to leave some time for some Q&A. Many of you have already submitted some amazing questions that we will go ahead and answer at the very end. But as you have questions along this entire webinar, please drop them in the chat and let us know. This is as much for you, so we want to make sure that you have all your questions answered. Okay, so with that, I'm going to pass this over to Dabby, and he's going to talk about what is a dispute and making sure that we all start on the same page when we are talking about disputes.
Thank you. Yeah, good question. What are disputes? So let's think about it this way. If a customer decides that they don't recognize or disagree with a certain transaction, all they can do is to call their bank to get their money refunded or charged back. And when this happens, the funds are typically returned to the customer immediately, and the onus falls on you as the merchant to file evidence to support your case that the charge was actually legitimate. There are several types of disputes, but they can typically be categorized into three main types. We have fraudulent disputes, where a customer believes a fraudulent actor used their card to make a charge. We have service disputes, where a customer knowingly made a purchase but disagrees with the transaction because they believe the service wasn't fulfilled as expected. For example, a customer can initiate a dispute if vendor services are not as described or not rendered at all. We also have the technical disputes, which is one of the less common types of disputes, but it includes chargebacks that are issued to correct billing mistakes, things like duplicate charges. One thing we should keep in mind when it comes to disputes is that issuers actually monitor the percent of disputed transactions a business has, which is your dispute rate. And if your dispute rate rises above a specified level, your business can actually be put into a monitoring program that attracts fines and penalties.
Okay, so we are going to just talk about some of the common myths around disputes and why they happen, because it's really important that we all understand what a dispute is, which Dabby just explained, but then what it's not and why there's some myths and what we can do to kind of counter these.
Yeah, definitely. We've heard so many things about disputes, and it's time to understand what is the myth and what is the real thing. Some of the myths we have, for example, we've heard that disputes only happen when the client is unhappy. We've heard that all disputes are fraudulent because disputes are always fraudulent. We've heard that clients will always reach out before disputing a charge. We've heard that disputes are a sign of bad business practices. We've heard that if you have a contract, you're 100% protected from disputes. And we've also heard that you can't fight a dispute. In the next slide, we will go over some of these myths and talk about the reality. So as regards to disputes only happen when a client is unhappy. Many disputes occur simply because the client doesn't recognize the charge on their statement. This is one of the largest drivers of disputes we see in the industry. The other myth that says disputes are always fraudulent is not actually the case, because some disputes are legitimate misunderstandings. Things like clients forgetting or not recognizing a certain business name in their credit card statement. We've heard that clients will always reach out prior to disputing a charge. That's not always the case, because some customers go straight to their bank without even contacting the business prior to filing a dispute. We've also heard that disputes are a sign of bad business practices. This is not true, because even the best run businesses still experience disputes. And what matters the most is having clear and concise policies and documentation to fight such disputes. We will be talking more about this in later slides. Another myth we have is that if you have a contract, you're absolutely protected. Now, I have to say that contracts are really, really important when it comes to fighting disputes, but they don't automatically absolve you or resolve the disputes. So you have to submit additional clear documentation and communication records. Lastly, we've heard that you can't fight a dispute. This is not the case. You absolutely can fight a dispute and should respond with strong, organized evidence. As a matter of fact, you might actually win the dispute if you attempt to fight it.
Okay, so in the wedding and event industry, at Rock Paper Coin, we see disputes happen for a whole host of reasons. And what we did is we kind of took the common ones that come up. So the first one is the paying party. Sometimes it's a completely different customer. So you may have a contract with the couple, but then the mother or the dad or a relative is actually making the payment. Well, when it comes time and they're reviewing their bank statements, they don't recognize the charge. So they assume it was made fraudulent. Even though it says the business name, they don't take the steps to go through and do research or ask around, and they just automatically flag it. And so I think the banks, they make it fairly easy to sometimes say when you don't recognize a charge. So this is probably the number one reason at Rock Paper Coin that we see is it's a charge not recognized and they'll mark it as fraudulent. The next is that a client claims maybe a vendor didn't show up or didn't deliver as expected. The wedding industry, we are working with people for typically like 9 to 12 months, and a lot can happen in that time period. And so clients can sometimes, feel wronged, whether that's right or wrong. They sometimes can feel that way, and so they file a dispute, maybe claiming for half the payment back or a portion or an installment. And it kind of ties into the next one, that the quality of the products was not what they expected and, was not up to the contract terms. Another is that, over like the refund policy. So when the couple wants to cancel or postpone, sometimes they can go back and dispute some of those initial charges if they're unhappy with how maybe a cancellation or a postponement fee happened. Now, we saw a lot of that during COVID, less now, but that was a big one a couple of years ago when people were wanting to push out or cancel. And so they were disputing some of those initial charges. When there's a discrepancy, so sometimes they see their final bill and, this can be by mistake or this can be an unexpected charge. So some of the common ones that we will see is that in the invoice, maybe it's for $100, they add a 20% gratuity. Well, they forget about that gratuity and they don't go back to that invoice. And then they just remember the invoice was 100, but now they're seeing 120. So there's sometimes things like that happen, or if in like terms of a rental, if there's damage to the product, in their contract, they state that they just charge the fee for any of the products that are damaged. So sometimes that can come up as well. And then weather conditions, we see this when things don't go as planned and maybe if something wasn't as properly executed. So these are just some of the common ones that we see at Rock Paper Coin. I will say that probably 70% are typically in that number one category where it's around not recognizing a charge. I will hand this over to Davies, and he's going to just talk about the different card payment types and what that means in regards to a dispute, because not all card payments types are equal.
Yes, correct. So when it comes to discussing disputes, the payment type actually matters. On your screen, we have three payment types. We have the credit card, we have the debit card, and ACH transfer. We will be discussing more about these payment types in detail. Starting from credit card disputes. The process involved with disputing a transaction when it comes to credit card is that the cardholder contacts their issuing bank to dispute the charge, Stripe is notified and deducts the disputed amount plus a fee from your account immediately. And in terms of the evidence window you typically have around 7 to 21 days to submit evidence, and the exact timing that you have is dependent on the card network. When talking about resolution timeline, issuers can take up to 30 to 90 days to resolve such disputes. And in terms of the final outcome, the issuing bank is responsible for making the final decision. A common myth is that you would think Stripe has some control over the final outcome, but that is not the case. It all depends on the issuing bank. Now, talking about debit card disputes, The process works the same way as credit cards, very similar in terms of, the customer contacts the bank, funds are pulled, Stripe initiates evidence collection. However, some key differences include the fact that debit card offers faster resolution in some cases due to network rules. For example, Visa and MasterCard debits may resolve or get resolved in 30 to 45 days. And sometimes disputes associated with debit cards are more favorable to the consumer. As for ACH disputes, ACH bank transfers, as some of you may know, ACH transfer is a computer-based system that facilitates electronic payments and transfer of funds between participating financial institutions. One key thing you have to understand when it comes to ACH transfers is that the dispute mechanism isn't called a chargeback, it's called a return. And the process is that a bank account holder can initiate a return for reasons like unauthorized transactions or errors. And Stripe would automatically deduct the fees and notify you. As regards to the evidence process, there is no formal dispute resolution via Stripe. And this is because ACH is governed by natural rules and banks typically side with the customer. When thinking about the resolution timeline for ACH transfers, banks can initiate a return up to 60 days after the transaction. And in terms of outcome, it's almost always refunded to the customers. So you have very little chance of winning a dispute from this payment type. So the image on your screen shows the high-level Stripe dispute process. And as mentioned, once a cardholder files a dispute, the bank retrieves the funds from the business via Stripe. Stripe also processes the dispute fee against the business. Stripe also informs the business of the dispute, at which point they have a preset amount of time to either submit evidence, accept the dispute, which means they lose the dispute, or do nothing. And once the time has passed, the cardholder's bank reviews the dispute. The bank can either decide that the cardholder was in the right and the charge was not legitimate, or based on evidence submitted, they can decide that the charge was legitimate and return the funds to the business. However, this only happens if a business submits evidence. Any other path will lead to the business losing the dispute.
Okay, so on rock, paper, coin, disputes are handled a little bit differently. Now, as Dabby just went through the Stripe process on the slide earlier, that is what's happening in the back end. But at rock, paper, coin, when you receive a dispute, you're going to be notified. Your account manager is going to get in touch with you and going to help walk you through this entire process. So they will be sending you an email. They'll ask for documentation. So anything that you can provide, the signed contract, emails, text messages, anything that really can help your case, we're going to compile all of that. I write a personal letter for every single dispute on rock, paper, coin. So it comes from me as the CEO, and I explain the situation and I attach all of the evidence and make it into one very clean format to then submit on your behalf. So we will then submit this written explanation and all the documentation to Stripe. Stripe walks through the process with the issuing bank typically, and then we will have a resolution once we hear back from Stripe. Now, one of the things to understand is that at rock, paper, coin, there is no fee for the disputes. So that is something that we actively try to, help businesses when they receive a dispute, understand the process, and then we don't want to add the additional burden by absorbing that fee here at rock, paper, coin. Additionally, for the ACH disputes, as Dabby mentioned, there is no evidence submitting. But what we have done is we've worked with a lawyer and we will have basically a demand letter that's drafted up. And what we'll do is we'll customize this demand letter and provide it to your business so that you can then go through, make any edits that you want, have it reviewed by another, legal counsel, and then send it off to that customer if you truly feel like you are owed that money and that you delivered, or, your contract states non-refundable retainers. So there are additional support tools that we are providing each business to make sure that you have the best chance at winning a dispute when you are supposed to win. So we see a lot of these, fraudulent charges that are accidental, and typically, getting in touch with the customers, they also will then rescind that dispute with their bank. That process is a little bit cleaner, but we really act as like your liaison and support and advocate for you as well on the back end. Okay, I'll pass this off to Davy for talking about kind of like how to prevent and then responding to disputes as well.
Thank you. So when it comes to preventing and responding to disputes, we've curated some disputes best practices for you. What you have on your screen are some steps you can take to proactively prevent disputes. They include, number one, making sure that customers understand what they can expect from your product or service and when they should receive it. Also, sharing your terms of service with your customer upfront so that there is no misunderstanding about how your service works or what your return, exchange, or other policies are is actually a key step that you can take. Additionally, signatures and countersigning contracts, work orders, or BEOs are also important steps you can take. Thirdly, you can provide updates on product readiness and delivery timelines so that customers know when to expect the product or service. Lastly, some providers like Stripe offer dispute prevention tools. Stripe's dispute prevention is powered by Verify from Visa and Etoka from MasterCard. And the package includes dispute deflection to help customers proactively recognize charges and dispute resolution to automatically resolve disputes, reducing the impact on your dispute rates. Another best practice that can help you reactively respond to disputes include implementing strategies to improve dispute win rate for your business. And you can do this by applying the following. Firstly, if you manage your own disputes, make sure you get an email or notification when you receive a dispute so that you can respond within the designated time frame. Secondly, depending on the dispute type, you may need to prove a different scenario to the issuer to win the dispute. Stripe has an online documentation that offers examples of what documents you can include. Lastly, AI-powered tools like Stripe Smart Disputes, which is currently in public preview, can automatically generate and submit evidence tailored to a dispute, saving you time managing them and maximizing your chance of winning.
Okay.
The last dispute best practice we'll be discussing today is using evidence best practices. And speaking of evidence best practices, you have to keep in mind that issuers review many disputes every day. So keeping evidence short and compelling helps highlight key points. The next point is that you need to ensure evidence format meets the requirements and you combine evidence files of the same file type. Lastly, submitting proof of customer authorization, proof of service delivery, and your terms of service and refund policy can significantly help validate that the customer was aware of the charge and it was delivered upon.
And one thing to add on here that we have seen is some people will submit social media as evidence and proof, and this typically is not part of our best practice recommendation. Is like posts or tags or the photos that you've that show that you were on site somewhere. what really helps is that written documentation. So I just can't stress enough that clear communication, clear documentation, the signature on a contract with a countersign. These are really important items, which are kind of part of this like key documents. I know that we're living in this age of a lot is on social media, but those are not typically viewed as kind of key documents. So just something to keep in mind as well. So we have taken this presentation and we have pared it down into a checklist format. So I'm going to leave this up on the screen for a little bit. This is kind of some of the best practices that we have talked about so that you can have this as almost like a little homework spreadsheet that you can save on your computer should a dispute arise. It also has our contact information. So if you have any questions, you can always reach out. I'll leave this up for just another minute while anyone grabs that. And then if you have any questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat. Right now, we're going to go through some of our pre-submitted questions that came in with registration. So I'll put these up on the screen. Okay, so I will ask the questions. What is the most important item to include in a contract to potentially avoid a dispute? So maybe I'll just take a stab at this and then Davy jump in and answer that as well. But I think one of the most important pieces that you can clearly state in the contract is not only what services you're providing and the deliverables, but a very detailed cancellation and refund policy. So if somebody is wanting to cancel or they're wanting to go after and get a refund, having really clear descriptions of what that means is very important and one of the things that is going to help to avoid a dispute. As I just mentioned first, the terms of the service or what you're the deliverables, having that, whether it's part of the contract or in a separate document like a scope of work or a BEO, the more detailed that you can be, and then with the communication to support that contract for deliverables, that right there is like very powerful for disputes. Okay, what kind of documentation must a vendor provide in order to actually win a dispute with Stripe? Maybe Davy, I'll let you take this one.
Yeah, thank you. Firstly, Stripe isn't in charge of resolving disputes. It's actually the issuers. And to the question, vendors must provide like a clear and concise documentation that proves the legitimacy of the transaction and the fulfillment of services. Just like we've been discussing, they can provide signed and countersigned contracts, work orders, BEOs, and so on and so forth.
All right. Okay, next question is, if the client already signed a contract, why do I still have to defend the charge? That is a good question. Davy, you want to take that one too?
Yeah, that's a really good question. If we think back to the presentation, we would know that the contract was signed between you and the customer in the absence of the issuers, right? So it's always a good idea to surface the contract to the issuers. When you sign the contract, the issuers were actually not present there. So even with signed contracts, customers can still claim that the contract terms were not fulfilled, and which is why you also need evidence to show that that service or product was actually delivered or fulfilled as well.
Okay. Does a high dispute rate hurt my business reputation with future payment processors?
Yeah. Actually, word of mouth can easily spread within the payments processing industry about problematic merchants. And you wouldn't want that reputation associated with your business. However, and most importantly, issuers can judge you harshly if you constantly have high dispute rates. And they may end up in a card monitoring program, which would actually attract fines and penalties. So you definitely don't want that.
Okay, next question is, I sell digital projects and services. Can clients dispute a download or a PDF? That is so interesting to think about.
Yes. Yeah. Actually, clients can dispute downloads of PDFs, even though they are digital products, right? They can say, or they can dispute them as items not received, simply claiming that they didn't get the download. They can go for product not as described, which essentially means that the content of the digital product just didn't meet their expectations. Or they can even go for unauthorized transactions, which means that they just didn't make the purchase themselves. It was an illegitimate purchase. So to prevent all of this from happening, you actually have to ensure you have log files that show download activities. It's also good practice to keep email records of purchase and download instructions, user activity logs, terms of service agreements that's specific to digital products, and so on and so forth.
Great. Does RPC or any other CRM reduce my chance of dispute? That is a good question. I'll take that one. So I can't speak to other CRMs, but I can speak to CRM. And the short answer is yes, absolutely. So at Rock Paper Coin, we track IP addresses, and we also have screen recordings that don't share sensitive information, but they can kind of walk through what the customer is doing on our site. So a lot of times in a dispute, when somebody says, I didn't authorize this charge, we can show the IP address where it was coming from and a recording of them walking through the invoice and clicking pay on the invoice and checking out. So there is a lot of documentation that happens at CRMs that can further provide, the logs and the information to submit to Stripe on your behalf. Debbie, did you have something to add to that as well?
Yeah, it wasn't actually to add to that, but it looks like we have some questions in the chat, and I think Dominic mentioned that he might be dropping off soon, so I wanted to make sure that we respond to that one before he drops off. So it looks like the question is from Lee, and it says, how does Stripe approach dispute resolution when the claim is so subjective? For example, my partner did a bad job on my wedding day. This is a good question, right? And it's similar to one of the pre-submitted questions we responded to. The short answer is that Stripe is not in charge of actually resolving the dispute. The dispute is always resolved by the issuers. So all Stripe has to do is to provide a portal through which you can submit your evidence to either show that, okay, you delivered according to the contract or the pre-agreed terms, and you outline them in a clear and concise manner, and Stripe can help forward that information to the issuers. It now depends on the issuers to make the final decision as regards to, if the claim is legitimate or not legitimate.
And we have seen this a few times, and typically what we'll find is that within communication from the client at some point during the planning process, they're saying like, oh, thank you so much, like this is helpful. And so really combing through all of that documentation, because if they thought that you've been doing a bad job for 12 months, like why did they continue working with you for 12 months? So looking through that communication to find those pieces where they're validating something or they're confirming something, and then all of the documentation that Dabby just talked about, which is like, you have very clear outlines of what you're delivering, and then you have a very clear documentation of how you delivered those. And sometimes you can submit all of that evidence to us, and then what we'll do is we'll help to pick and choose what we're actually submitting. We can't submit everything under the moon, but we can make it so that you have the strongest case, even when there are subjective claims like that. The subjective claims are typically a little bit trickier, and that's where really the demand letter comes into effect. If you happen to lose that dispute, this demand letter is more of like a, hey, these were the terms, this is what was delivered. And like, just because you lose a dispute doesn't mean that your contract wouldn't hold up in court. And so the demand letter is kind of that first step of like, I'm demanding this money get paid back, and that is owed to me. And if not, we can then proceed on. Typically in contracts, then having some sort of, disclaimer about what happens if you need to go, into a legal dispute of some point.
Yeah. It looks like we also have a follow-up question to what we just discussed, which is like, if we have any insights on how the issuers view subjective claims. And it seems to be in line with what we've been discussing in terms of every dispute is different. I would say slightly different, because sometimes you can't necessarily use the same format to approach every type of dispute. So you need to tailor your evidence submission to that particular dispute. If you're using Stripe and not rock paper coin, for example, you have to submit things that we've explained before, showing that the customer is aware of that transaction and you delivered as needed. And if you're using rock paper coin, Elizabeth has talked on how the business can help you even um, uh, put together some of these documents and help maximize the chance of you winning the dispute.
And Debbie, one thing with this, would you recommend any businesses go out to other vendors to get a letter from them of like, yes, these services were delivered. I was on site at this wedding at this time and I witnessed X, Y, and Z. Like, is that helpful documentation? Or should it really just be between the business and the customer that's filing the dispute?
Yeah. I actually can't specifically say if including like third party um letters from third party. I don't know how that would sway the judgment from the issuers. However, one thing I would say is that you actually have to learn a lot from your successful disputes, right? So if you filed a dispute in the past and you're successful, you can actually look at what you did right from when it comes to having the initial discussion with the customer till winning the dispute. You can look at that process and try to mirror other like dispute submissions or other claim to be similar. However, you have to still include new information and make sure you're keeping it fresh. But I can't exactly say what factors will sway it in your favor exactly.
Mhm. Okay. Um, just in case if Dominic's still on, let's just jump to that last question about any specific
Yeah.
product that Stripe will provide for chargebacks and how does it compare to Ethica?
Yeah, good question. So the answer is yes. We have an AI-powered tool like Stripe Smart Dispute, which I mentioned earlier on, and it's currently in public preview. And what it does is that it can automatically generate and submit evidence tailored to a specific dispute. And what this does is that it saves you a lot of time when it comes to managing the disputes, and it maximizes your chance of winning such disputes. Keep in mind that it takes into consideration data from Stripe's large network, the transaction in question, and the cardholder data. So while smart disputes can assist you, it's actually not a replacement for professional advice on handling disputes. So unlike other um, dispute prevention services like Verify, Stripe Smart Dispute actually helps manage disputes after they've been filed. Some of those other services like Verify and they actually help to prevent disputes from occurring in the first place, as opposed to helping you fight the disputes.
And we recently did a like internal study and around like data and disputes at Rock Paper Coin, and um, in 2024, we had a dispute rate of 0.01%. To put that into perspective, that's like 1 in 10,000 invoices filed a dispute. In 2025, we did some work in partnership with Stripe to make it so, that we were trying to reduce our disputes. And in 2025 to date, it's 1 in 16,000 invoices. So that's 0.006%. The industry rate is kind of hovering around 0.5%. So it's very important like to understand that when you are using a CRM, there is email audits, there are email trails, there's documentation that they can search for in their inbox. There is then all of the documentation and the like audit trails that we're capturing. So I think it's important also to like know that disputes, while we're talking about them and they sound like big and that they're happening all the time, like they are rare, and that there are good practices that you can put in place to protect yourself against disputes. But it's also like educating your clients about like what you're going to be performing, what happens, the expectation, just clear communication. So we're talking about this, but it is pretty rare, and it does happen. And when it does, it can be really frustrating. So that's why, the Stripe team and the Rock Paper Coin team, like we're both here to support everybody. So with that, I want to introduce then one of the questions where disputes are on the rise and what's causing the spike in our industry and why are we not being protected when it's the clients who are being fraudulent. So I said all of that knowing this was the question because it feels like disputes are on the rise, but in reality, I don't think that they actually are. It's just that we are all now in a much more communicative like fashion where we are talking more with vendors. Disputes used to, make people be like, oh my gosh, did I do a bad job? I'm like, this is such a bad mark on my business. And that's not the case at all. So everyone's just sharing more. But the data that we have at Rock Paper Coin is that disputes are dropping. And yes, disputes as a whole, probably like from when we look back 10 years ago, it feels like there's more because there's a lot more online payments that are happening and there's not cash and check. And there's the, risks of cash and check as well. So it's just balancing those two. So I kind of counter that question with like, our data does not show that disputes are on the rise. And I think we have more documentation than ever to be countering a dispute when it does happen. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, go ahead. Do you want to add
Yeah.
something to that?
Yeah, I would just say that, what you said is really on point because it's like, yes, dispute is happening even in the industry overall, but Rock Paper Coin have put a lot of best practices and processes in place to ensure that their dispute rate is even going against the industry standard. So that's a really good thing.
Yeah. The other interesting fact too, and there isn't necessarily a correlation, but I want to call this out from, is that we saw in 2024, 23% of the vendors on Rock Paper Coin were countersigning their contracts. And in 2025, right now we're sitting at 50%. And so I do think that there are these standard best practices that are being talked about in the industry by, really good educators and leaders that are talking about the importance of your contract, the importance of countersigning that contract, and all of that plays into the disputes for sure. Okay, so yes, Leah, I know that's frightening that even 50% aren't signing. I very much agree with that. Okay, in a world where the customer is always right, how do I protect myself from clients who conveniently ghosted me after disputing a charge? And that is very, very tricky and very frustrating, but hopefully you have had the documentation leading up to that to be able to counter it. And Stripe and Rock Paper Coin, any attempt at communication is very important to prove. If you can say, hey, listen, I have been attempting to resolve this, outside of a dispute for now, whatever, 20 days, 30 days, 45 days, like that plays really well into being like, listen, we've tried to resolve this. On the customer side, the disputes, they make it probably a little easier than I would like to submit a dispute, but they do have to provide some documentation. And typically that asks if they've made an attempt to resolve this before a dispute's being filed. So the more evidence that you have around the attempt at a resolution is really important. Okay, did we get through all of our questions? I kind of think we did. So, let's see if anybody has any other questions, pop them in. Otherwise, we can kind of just start to wrap this up and say thank you so much. I'm going to go back to this QR code really quick, and I'll leave this here on the page again, just as a reminder. This was such a wonderful conversation. We're so lucky to have an expert like Dabby sharing all of the tips with us today. So Dabby, again, just big, big thank you to you and to everybody that joined us. I hope that you took away some valuable information about how you can better safeguard yourself against those pesky disputes.
Yeah, it's really, really nice to be here and, help discuss about disputes.
All right. Well, make sure you check out Rock Paper Coin if you are not already a member, and Stripe, who are wonderful partners of ours. And we're so appreciative of everybody's time today. So thank you so much, everyone.